Rain had been falling over the plains for 4 straight days, turning the dirt road into a river of mud and turning every wagon on the trail into a fragile shell barely, holding desperate lives inside. But none more desperate than the young widow who crouched inside her torn canvas tent, her arms wrapped around her little daughter as if shielding her from the wind, could also shield her from reality, a reality that had stolen her husband, her home, her livestock, and every bit of security she once believed was unshakable. And now, with her eyes hollow from exhaustion and her voice cracked from pleading with a sky that had offered no mercy, she whispered words she had never thought she would speak aloud. "We haven't eaten in 5 days," words that felt like shards of glass leaving her throat, carrying the weight of helplessness, shame, and a mother's terror. And just as thunder rolled across the hills, the curtain of her tent lifted and revealed a silhouette on horseback, a man framed by rain and light like some figure carved out of the storm itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his coat soaked, his hat dripping, a rugged rancher with eyes that saw more than he ever let on, eyes that softened when they met hers. He dismounted slowly, deliberate and calm, as if he knew sudden movements might shatter the fragile strength she still held onto. And he approached her with softness that contrasted his intimidating presence, kneeling just outside the tent, where the mud clung to his boots like glue. He reached into his saddlebag without a word, and the widow instinctively pulled her daughter closer. Though her trembling hands told the truth, fear wasn't her enemy now. Hunger was. The rancher pulled out a small loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth, something warm, something smelling faintly of home, and he extended it toward her as if offering salvation. She hesitated, her pride warring with her desperation. But the moment her daughter's tiny fingers reached for the bread, the widow's resistance collapsed, and tears streaked down her face as she accepted it with both trembling hands. The rancher watched quietly as she broke the loaf into small pieces for her child, each motion tender, careful, almost reverent. And when the little girl devoured the bread with shaking hands, something inside the rancher cracked, a memory of his own mother feeding him after his father had died. A memory he had buried beneath years of ranch work, loneliness and responsibility. "Thank you," the widow whispered, her voice barely audible through the storm, and he nodded, tipping his hat as if this small act was nothing more than what any man should do. But then she saw it. Inside his bag there was nothing left. No dried meat, no extra rations, no second loaf. The bread he had handed her was the last piece he owned, the last of his supplies before a 50-mile ride back to his ranch. And she understood instantly the magnitude of what he had given. Not just food, but sacrifice, the kind of gesture that carried meaning deeper than kindness. It carried intent, conviction, and a silent vow. The rancher stood, glanced at the storming horizon and said, "You shouldn't be out here alone." But the widow shook her head, explaining how her husband had fallen sick during the journey west, how he died 2 mornings ago, how the others had abandoned her wagon when the wheel broke, leaving her and her daughter to either survive or disappear into the wilderness. The rancher listened, jaw tightening, anger flickering in his eyes, not at her, but at the cruelty of a world that demanded too much from those who had too little. Rain lashed harder, wind howled, the wagon canvas tore another inch, and the widow's daughter whimpered, clutching her mother's dress. Finally, the rancher made a decision, one that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. "Pack what you've got left," he said. "You're coming with me." And though fear rose in the widow's chest, something else rose stronger, trust, fragile but real, born not from words, but from an act of pure, quiet sacrifice. She nodded, gathering the few belongings she had, while the rancher lifted her daughter onto his horse, wrapping her in his own coat to protect her from the cold. He helped the widow climb up next, her hands shaking as she settled behind him, and with one last look at the ruined tent that had been her only home for days, he clicked his heels and steered the horse toward the open plains. They rode into the storm together, 3 souls bound not by blood or past, but by a moment of mercy that would soon become something much bigger. something neither of them could yet name. The storm chased them across the plains like a hungry beast, but the rancher drove his horse forward with steady determination, guiding the widow and her daughter through sheets of rain and flashes of lightning, until the world finally softened into dawn light, revealing rolling fields of grass and a distant line of wooden fencing, his land, sprawling, quiet, alive, a place that seemed to breathe warmth despite the storm that had battered it through the night. The widow stared in awe as the ranch house came into view, sturdy and welcoming, with smoke curling from the chimney and lanterns still burning in the windows. And something in her chest tightened, not fear but hope, a feeling she had tried to bury since her husband's death. As the rancher helped her down from the horse, her legs wobbled from weakness and hunger, and she nearly stumbled, but his arm shot out, steady and warm, catching her with a gentleness she didn't expect from a man who looked carved from raw earth and hard labor. He carried her daughter inside where the housekeeper, an elderly woman with sharp instincts and an even sharper tongue, gasped at the sight of the two strangers before, immediately ushering them toward the kitchen, clucking about storms and starving children while the rancher disappeared into the storage room to gather food, when he returned with a pot of stew, bread, and jars of preserved fruit. The widow felt overwhelmed by the abundance, too much, almost painful to witness after days of nothing, and she began to cry silently as her daughter ate, her small hands shaking as if she feared the food might vanish. The rancher took a seat across from them, his eyes soft, watching as life slowly returned to the little girl's cheeks and the widow's. Trembling movements turned calm. When the widow finally lifted her gaze to meet his, she whispered, "Why are you helping us?" But the rancher didn't answer right away, staring instead at the steam rising from his untouched bowl, as if weighing truths he rarely shared. Finally he looked up and said, "Because someone once saved me and my ma the same way. I made a promise I'd repay it someday," and the simplicity of the word struck her, deeper than any grand gesture. Days passed, and the widow regained strength while the rancher repaired her broken wagon, though each evening he lingered on the porch with her, talking about the land, the seasons, and the scars life etched into people when they weren't looking. She found herself smiling again, small smiles at first, then real ones, as her daughter ran through the fields, chasing barn cats and butterflies, giggling like a child who had never known hunger. The rancher remained steady, present, offering help without demanding anything in return. Though every time their hands brushed, every time their eyes met across the dinner table, something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, dangerous, warm. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky gold, the rancher brought the widow to the small garden behind the barn, a quiet place where wildflowers grew despite the rough soil. He stopped, turned to her, and spoke with a depth she had not expected. "I ain't a man who dances around what he feels," he said, voice low, rough with honesty. "You and that little girl, you belong here, if you want it, if you'll have me." The widow froze, breath catching, because though she had sensed the growing bond between them, she never imagined he would speak the words aloud. Not like this, not with such raw sincerity. He took a slow breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small silver ring, not fancy, not new, but polished and treasured, explaining it had belonged to his mother, and he would only offer it to a woman he intended to give his life to. Tears welled in her eyes, memories of loss and fear swirling with new, fragile hope, and she whispered, "Why me?" The rancher stepped closer, brushing a tear from her cheek with his calloused thumb, and said, "Because when I gave you that bread, I didn't just want you to survive, I wanted you to stay. I wanted you to have my home, and my name." The words unraveled the last of her resistance, and she nodded, not out of desperation, but out of something deeper, something that had grown slowly, like roots in the broken pieces of her life. He slipped the ring onto her finger as the wind rustled the wildflowers around them, carrying their silent vows into the fading light. When they walked back toward the house, her daughter ran to them, wrapping her small arms around the rancher's leg, calling his name with trust that came naturally. And as he lifted the little girl into his arms, the widow knew with absolute certainty she had found safety, belonging, and a love rebuilt from the ashes of hunger and loss, born the moment he handed her bread and sealed forever. When he offered his name,